I didn't expect the laugh to sting. It was light, casual, almost affectionate. But it landed somewhere deep, the way certain words do when they brush against a truth you weren't ready to admit. We were sitting around the dining table after dinner. Nothing special. Just leftover rice, a simple curry, the hum of the ceiling fan filling the pauses. I'd washed the plates already and poured myself a cup of tea, standing near the counter because my knees had been aching all evening. 57 does that to you. Not dramatically. Just quietly. I've been thinking, I said, more to the room than to anyone in particular. Maybe in 3 or 4 years I'll retire. Nothing fancy. Just slow down. I didn't say I'm tired. I didn't say my body hurts. I didn't say I want mornings that belong to me. I thought slow down was safe enough. My son looked up from his phone, surprised. His wife blinked, then smiled. Retire, she repeated, like she was tasting a strange word. My son chuckled. Ma, you'll get bored in a week. She laughed too. Not unkindly. Not cruelly. Just easily. You don't even know how to relax, she said. You'll end up taking another job. I smiled because that's what I've always done when someone misunderstands me. I smiled so they wouldn't feel awkward. So the moment would pass. I don't need much, I said softly. Just enough. That's when she tilted her head and said, Exactly. You don't really need much, right? The sentence floated there. No sharp edges. No accusation. Just a statement delivered with certainty. My son nodded, already distracted again. You're simple that way, Ma. Simple. As if simplicity meant absence of desire. As if living quietly meant wanting nothing. They moved on to talking about traffic, about a colleague's promotion, about rising rent. The conversation carried on, smooth and ordinary. But something in me had shifted. Subtly, like a chair leg wobbling under weight it had carried for years without complaint. I sat down slowly, the tea untouched in my hand. For decades I'd been the steady one. The one who saved without announcing it. The one who never discussed money unless it was necessary. When my son needed tuition fees, I paid without explanation. When there were emergencies, I didn't ask questions. I believed security worked best when it was invisible. I thought that was love. Now, listening to them talk about their future vacations, bigger spaces, maybe a second car someday, I realized something uncomfortable. My future had already been edited out of the conversation. Not intentionally. Not maliciously. But completely. Later that night, after they went to bed, I stood in my room folding laundry. The same way I'd done for years. My hands knew the movements by heart. Shirts squared. Towels aligned. Everything neat, contained. But my mind kept returning to that moment. You don't really need much, right? Who decided that? I tried to be reasonable with myself. They didn't mean harm. They were young. Everyone assumes their parents will be fine. I told myself I was being sensitive. Still, something felt off. I opened my old notebook, the one where I scribbled reminders and lists. Without planning to, I wrote down a number. My savings. I stared at it longer than I ever had before. I realized that every time I thought about that money, I imagined emergencies, needs, other people, never myself. That night, sleep didn't come easily. The house was quiet, but my thoughts weren't. I replayed the laugh, the nod, the certainty in their voices. They weren't guessing. They weren't hoping. They were assuming. And for the first time in years, I wondered if my silence had taught them something I never intended to teach at all. As I turned off the light, one question settled heavily in my chest. If I don't claim my own future, who already has? I told myself it was just one conversation. One careless laugh. One harmless assumption. That's what reasonable people do. They minimize before they accuse. They smooth rough moments down until they fit neatly back into daily life. And for a while I managed that. But once something cracks inside you, you start noticing the hairline fractures everywhere else. Over the next few weeks, I became aware of how often money entered our conversations. Not directly. Never bluntly. It slipped in sideways, disguised as jokes, casual remarks, future talk. My daughter-in-law would mention how expensive things were getting. Groceries. Fuel. Rent. Always followed by a sigh, always paired with, everything costs so much these days. Then she'd glance at me and smile. Good thing you planned ahead, Auntie. Planned ahead. For what, exactly? One Sunday afternoon we were sitting in the living room, the television on but nobody really watching. My son was scrolling through listings on his phone. "Look at this place," he said, turning the screen toward his wife. "Bit expensive, but it's closer to my office." She frowned. "Too expensive. Unless..." She stopped herself, then laughed. "Unless we suddenly get rich." My son grinned. "Well, Ma's always been good with money." He said it like a compliment. Like pride. I nodded automatically, the way mothers do when their children praise them. But inside something tightened. Good with money. Did that mean disciplined or available? I began replaying older moments in my head. Things I'd brushed aside before. The time my son said, "You don't really spend on yourself anyway." The time my daughter-in-law joked, "You're basically our safety net." Safety net. I'd laughed then too. Now those words felt heavier. One evening while chopping vegetables, I overheard them discussing their future plans in the next room. Nothing dramatic. Just logistics. "If we have a kid in a few years," she said, "we'll need more space." My son replied, "We'll manage. Things will fall into place." Fall into place. I knew what that meant. I'd said it myself for years when money was tight, when unexpected expenses came up. It was a phrase built on quiet sacrifice. I waited for him to say something else. Something about saving. Something about responsibility. Instead, he added, "And Ma won't be alone then. She'll have us." I froze, knife hovering above the cutting board. Have us. As if that was the plan. As if my future had already been decided, negotiated in sentences I wasn't invited into. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was standing in the middle of a room everyone else had already measured and furnished, without asking me where I wanted to sit. I started paying attention to tone, to pauses, to what wasn't said. They never asked me what kind of retirement I wanted, where I wanted to live, how I imagined my days. They spoke around me, not to me, like my role was fixed and understood. Provider. Anchor. Backup. Not a woman nearing the end of a long working life. Not someone allowed to want rest. I caught myself doing something new. Listening without responding. Observing instead of smoothing things over. Felt unnatural at first. Silence has always made me uncomfortable. I was trained to fill it, to keep things pleasant. But the silence revealed things words never had. Their certainty wasn't cruel. That was the hardest part. It was comfortable. Familiar. Built over years of me saying yes, of me not drawing lines. One afternoon while folding clothes, my son walked past and said casually, "Don't stress about retirement, Ma. You're sorted." Sorted. I looked at him then. Really looked. He wasn't dismissive. He wasn't mocking. He genuinely believed what he was saying. That realization hurt more than any insult could have. Because it meant this wasn't a misunderstanding waiting to be corrected. It was an expectation that had grown roots. And I had helped water it. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, a quiet thought surfaced, uncomfortable but honest. If they already see my future as settled, what happens when I change it? The question didn't scare me yet. But it stayed. I grew up believing that talking about money was impolite. You worked hard, you saved quietly, and you didn't announce either. My parents never discussed their finances in front of us. We just knew the bills were paid and the fridge was full. That was love. Silent. Reliable. I carried that belief into my own life. When my husband passed away years ago, there was no dramatic shift. No collapse. I did what I had always done. Tightened my routines, cut unnecessary expenses, and kept going. I didn't tell my son how carefully I counted each month. I didn't tell anyone how many nights I stayed awake calculating figures in my head. I wanted him to feel secure. I wanted him to grow up without fear. So I never said things like "this is all I have" or "this is for later." I just said, "It's fine." And most of the time it was. I worked steadily. I turned down trips. I wore clothes longer than I should have. I learned to enjoy simple pleasures because they cost less and asked for nothing. Over the years, saving became instinct, not strategy. And somewhere along the way, silence turned into invisibility. I realized that my son had never seen me plan for myself. He'd seen me provide, help, adjust. To him, money existed to solve problems, his problems mostly. That wasn't his fault. It was the only version he'd ever known. One memory returned sharply one afternoon while I was sorting old documents. He was 16. He needed money for a course he wanted to take. I'd hesitated, not because I didn't have it but because it would stretch things. He'd said, "It's okay if it's hard, Ma. You always manage." At the time I'd felt proud. Now, years later, that sentence echoed differently. You always manage. Management absorb, stretch, sacrifice, and never say how much it cost. As I sat on the floor surrounded by old files, insurance papers, tax slips, employment letters, I saw my life laid out in neat, quiet order. Everything accounted for. Everything documented. Except my intentions. There was no record anywhere of what the money was meant for. No conversation. No declaration. Just assumptions growing in the empty spaces I'd left behind. I wondered when I'd last said out loud, "This is mine." Even thinking it felt strange. Possessive. Selfish almost. Women my age were taught to frame everything as duty. As family. As necessity. Wanting something for yourself, especially later in life, felt indulgent. But as I sorted through papers, another realization surfaced. Silence had protected my family, but it had also erased me. The problem wasn't that my son and daughter-in-law were planning around my savings. The problem was that I'd never corrected the narrative. I'd let them believe the money existed in a shared, undefined space. Not theirs. Not mine. Just there. That night, I found myself standing in front of the mirror longer than usual. The lines around my eyes didn't bother me. The tiredness didn't shock me. What unsettled me was how little space I'd allowed myself to occupy in my own life. I thought about retirement again. Not the numbers this time, but the feeling. Quiet mornings. Reading without watching the clock. Walking without rushing. A life measured by time, not obligation. For the first time, I let myself imagine it without guilt. And that's when the fear crept in. Because imagining something is the first step toward wanting it. And wanting it means defending it. I wasn't sure yet how to do that. But I knew one thing with unsettling clarity. If I didn't give my future a voice, it would continue to be spoken for. It happened on an ordinary afternoon. The kind that never announces itself as important. I was folding clothes in my bedroom, windows open to let in the weak winter sun. The house was quieter than usual. My son was working late. His wife was home on the phone in the living room. I wasn't listening. I never listened. Privacy mattered to me. It always had. But voices travel in familiar houses. They slip through doorways, settle into corners. "No, I'm not worried," she said, her tone relaxed, almost cheerful. "Worst case, we're covered." I folded a towel, smoothing the edge carefully. "There's always Ma's savings," she continued. "She's not going anywhere." My hands stopped. I stood there, towel half folded, breath shallow. I told myself I'd misheard. I wanted to mishear. So I stayed still, hoping the conversation would move on. Instead, it deepened. "She doesn't spend. Never has," my daughter-in-law said. "Honestly, it's like money just sits there. Money just sits there." I felt something drop inside me, not sharply, not painfully. More like something heavy being set down, finally, after years of carrying it unknowingly. She laughed softly. "By the time we need it, it'll be enough. And anyway, she'll be with us. That's how these things go. That's how these things go." I waited for my son's voice. He was home by then. I'd heard the door earlier. I waited for him to say something. To correct her. To remind her that my life wasn't an insurance policy. He didn't. He murmured something I couldn't fully hear. Not disagreement. Not reassurance either. Just presence. Agreement without words. I stepped back slowly, careful not to make a sound. My heart wasn't racing. That surprised me. I'd expected panic. Anger. Tears. Instead, there was a strange calm, cold but clear. This wasn't speculation. This wasn't casual talk. This was planning. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the towel in my hands. It was old. Faded. I kept it longer than I should have because it still worked. That thought made me almost smile. I thought about all the times I'd chosen still works over I want. All the justifications I'd built around restraint. How proud I'd been of needing less. And now, that very restraint had been translated into availability. I stayed in my room until the call ended. When I finally stepped out, my daughter-in-law looked up, smiled, asked if I wanted tea. Her voice was warm, normal, loving even. I said yes. That was the hardest part. Not the entitlement, not the assumption, but how gently it lived alongside affection. How no one in that room believed they were doing anything wrong. Later that evening, my son mentioned work stress. His wife talked about a friend's pregnancy. We ate dinner together like always. The conversation flowed. No tension. No awkwardness. They didn't know I knew. And I didn't tell them. Because something inside me understood that once words were spoken, there would be no taking them back. Confrontation would turn this into a debate, a negotiation of feelings, of intentions. But this wasn't about intention. It was about reality. That night, lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling and replayed the phrases I'd heard. Worst case, we're covered. She's not going anywhere. That's how these things go. They hadn't asked. They hadn't confirmed. They'd simply built their future on a foundation they assumed was permanent. Me. I felt older in that moment, not tired, not defeated, just aware. Awareness ages you. It strips away illusions you didn't know you were relying on. I realized then that love without boundaries teaches people to lean without checking whether the ground beneath them is still willing to hold. And for the first time, I asked myself a question I'd avoided for years. What if I step aside? The thought didn't feel cruel. It felt necessary. I didn't confront them. Not because I was afraid, but because I knew myself well enough to understand what confrontation would do. It would turn into reassurance, into backtracking, into me softening the edges so no one felt uncomfortable. I'd done it my whole life. Explained myself until my own feelings sounded unreasonable. So instead, I chose something unfamiliar. I stayed quiet. Not the polite silence I'd always practiced, but an observant one. I listened without correcting. I watched without stepping in. First, it felt unnatural. Silence has weight when you're used to carrying conversations. During dinner, when my daughter-in-law talked about rising school fees someday, I didn't say, "We'll manage." When my son mentioned long-term plans, I didn't nod encouragingly. I just listened. And in that listening, patterns sharpened. They spoke of the future as a shared project, one that included me only as a constant, never as a decision-maker. Later on, things will be easier, my son said one evening, gesturing vaguely. We'll all be settled. Settled meant stable. Settled meant predictable. Settled meant unchanged. I noticed how often my retirement was framed as optional, flexible, postponable. You don't have to stop working completely, my daughter-in-law said one morning while pouring tea. Just do something part-time. Keeps you active. Keeps you active. As if rest were dangerous. As if stillness had to be justified. I started hearing the subtext in everything. Not cruelty, comfort. The comfort of certainty. Of knowing someone else would absorb risk. I stopped volunteering information about my plans. When they asked about work, I answered briefly. When they talked about expenses, I didn't offer solutions. This small withdrawal changed the atmosphere in ways I hadn't anticipated. They began filling the silence themselves. My son started explaining things more. Over-clarifying. As if trying to reassure himself. You know, Ma, whatever happens, we're family. No one's ever on their own. It was meant to sound warm. Sounded like ownership. One afternoon, I sat in the living room with a cup of tea, watching the light move across the floor. My daughter-in-law was on her laptop, browsing something. She turned the screen toward me. Do you like this layout? She asked. It's practical. Good for later. Later. I asked. Later when? She paused just for a second, then smiled. You know, in a few years. I nodded. That pause told me more than a long conversation ever could. They weren't malicious. They weren't plotting. They were simply continuing a story that had been written over years of my compliance. And the most difficult realization came quietly, on an ordinary day. They weren't asking because they didn't think they needed to. The space I occupied in their future felt fixed. Unchanging. I began to feel like furniture. Important. Useful. Always there. I thought about all the times I'd stepped in to make things easier. All the times I'd filled gaps without being asked. I believed I was helping. Now I understood I'd been teaching. One evening, as I was heading to my room, my son called out, Ma, you're okay with things as they are, right? The question caught me off guard. It was the first time anyone had asked me something directly in weeks. I looked at him. He was waiting for reassurance, for the familiar answer. "I'm thinking," I said instead. "Just that." His expression shifted, confusion flickering across his face. "About what?" "About a lot of things," I replied. I walked away before he could respond. That night, lying in bed, I felt something settle inside me. Not anger. Not resolve yet. Awareness. Watching had done what explaining never could. It showed me exactly where I stood. And once you know your place in someone else's story, you have a choice. You can stay there. Or you can move. The bank smelled faintly of disinfectant and paper. Clean, neutral, impersonal. I liked that. Places like this didn't ask about feelings. They asked for numbers. I hadn't planned the visit dramatically. No sleepless night had driven me there. It was a weekday afternoon, sandwiched between errands. I told myself I was just reviewing things, being responsible. That's what I'd always been. I sat across from the desk, my handbag on my lap, fingers curled around the strap. The young bank executive smiled politely, typing my details into his system. "Just a routine review?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "I want to understand where things stand. Where I stand." He nodded and began pulling up my accounts. Fixed deposits. Savings. A small pension fund. Numbers appeared on the screen, familiar, yet strangely distant. I'd known them for years, but I'd never looked at them this way. Not as potential. As exposure. "Your savings account has multiple linked access points," he said casually. "Joint authorizations, nominees." He paused, then glanced at me. "Is that intentional?" The question landed softly, but it landed. I swallowed. "It's how it's always been." He nodded again, neutral. "Many people do it that way. Many people don't question things until they have to." He walked me through each account. Who had access? Who was listed? How easily money could be moved. How unprotected some of it actually was. I felt a slow creeping unease. "So if something happens," I asked carefully, "decisions could be made quickly?" "Yes," he replied. "That's usually the idea." I thought of the phrase my daughter-in-law had used, worst case. I wondered what worst case meant to them. And what it meant to me. He slid a paper toward me with neat columns and totals. I stared at it longer than necessary. For the first time, I felt the weight of what I'd built. Not as pride, but as responsibility. This wasn't abstract security. It was my life, reduced to figures that could be redirected without my voice. The executive hesitated, then asked gently, "May I ask, what are your plans for this money?" I opened my mouth, closed it again. Plans. I'd answered that question 100 times for other people. Education. Marriage. Emergencies. Stability. But for myself? "I'm not sure," I admitted. He didn't push. Just nodded like someone who'd heard that answer before. "Take your time," he said. "But clarity helps. Especially as retirement approaches." Retirement. The word felt heavier here, under fluorescent lights, surrounded by documents and signatures. He explained options calmly. Protections. Structures. Things I could do, not urgently, not dramatically, but deliberately. I didn't commit to anything that day. I just listened, took notes, asked questions I'd never allowed myself to ask before. On the way home, I stopped at a cafe. Sat by the window with a cup of tea I didn't really want. I took out the papers again and studied them slowly. Every number told a story. Years of restraint. Of choosing later over now. And suddenly a thought settled in, clear and unavoidable. This money had always been treated as shared because I'd never claimed it as mine. That wasn't cruelty. It was structure. At home, I filed the papers carefully in a folder labeled simply, Future. That night, my son mentioned upcoming expenses. My daughter-in-law talked about plans. I listened, but something had shifted. I now had facts instead of feelings, evidence instead of suspicion. And with that came a strange sense of calm. Because once things are written down, once they're visible, they stop being emotional mysteries and start becoming choices. As I turned off the light, I realized something quietly powerful. This wasn't about taking anything away. It was about finally deciding where my life belonged. I met her for coffee on a Wednesday afternoon, the kind of day that feels suspended between responsibilities. Neither work nor home demanded me urgently, and that in itself felt like a small luxury. Mira and I had worked together years ago. We weren't the kind of friends who spoke every week. We were the kind who could sit together after months of silence and continue where we left off. She knew my life in chapters, not daily updates, and sometimes that made honesty easier. We chose a quiet cafe. No music loud enough to interrupt thoughts. No rush. She noticed something immediately. "You seem thoughtful," she said, stirring her tea. "Not tired. Just somewhere else." I smiled. "That obvious?" She smiled back. "Only to people our age." I told her more than I planned to. Not dramatically. Just facts. Comments. Conversations. The bank visit. The feeling of being written into someone else's future without consultation. She listened without interrupting. No sharp intake of breath. No outrage on my behalf. Just attention. When I finished, she leaned back slightly and asked a question so simple it startled me. "If this wasn't your child," she said gently, "would you allow this?" I opened my mouth and closed it. The question didn't accuse. It didn't demand justification. It simply rearranged the situation. I thought of a colleague, a neighbor, a distant relative. If any of them spoke about my savings as if it were theirs, I wouldn't hesitate. I'd correct them, set boundaries, protect myself. But motherhood had softened the edges, turned clarity into guilt. "I don't want to hurt him," I said quietly. Mira nodded. "Of course not. But protecting yourself isn't the same as hurting someone." She took a sip of her tea, then added, "You're not taking something away. You're just not giving something that was never promised." That sentence settled slowly, like sediment in water. I'd been framing this all wrong. As loss. As withdrawal. As betrayal in reverse. But it wasn't that. It was definition. We talked about retirement, not money but life. What it looks like when it's your own. Mornings without alarms. Days without being needed by default. "When did you last choose something just because you wanted it?" she asked. I couldn't remember. That frightened me more than anything my son had said. Before we left, Mira squeezed my hand. "Whatever you decide," she said, "do it calmly. Don't explain too much. People mistake explanations for negotiations." I laughed softly. "That sounds like you've learned the hard way." She smiled. "We all do. Or we don't." On the way home, her words echoed in my mind. Protecting yourself isn't the same as hurting someone. Definition, not withdrawal. That night, my son called me into the living room. "Ma," he said, hesitating slightly, "you've been quiet lately. Everything okay?" I looked at him. Really looked. He was concerned. Not calculating. Not cruel. "I'm fine," I said. "Just thinking." "About what?" I paused. "About the next phase of my life." He nodded, relieved. "Don't stress too much. Things will work out." I smiled, but this time I understood what that sentence had always meant. Things would work out. For them. As I went to bed, Mira's question returned one last time, steady, unyielding. This wasn't my child. Why was I the only one expected to compromise? He called me the next evening, just as I was switching off the kitchen light. "Ma," my son said, his voice careful, "did I say something wrong the other day?" I leaned against the counter, phone pressed to my ear. The house felt unusually quiet. "No," I said. "Why would you think that?" "You've been distant," he replied. I just wanted to check. There it was. The moment I'd been expecting without admitting it to myself. Concern wrapped in familiarity. "I've just been tired," I said. It wasn't a lie. It just wasn't the whole truth. He exhaled softly, relieved. "I was worried you were stressing about retirement again." Again. As if it were a recurring inconvenience. "Ma, you don't need to worry so much," he continued. "You've done enough. Whatever happens, we're here. We're here." The phrase sounded supportive. It always had. But now I heard the weight behind it, the implication of permanence, of direction. "I know," I said carefully. He went on, warming to the reassurance. "I mean, you don't have to make any big decisions. There's no rush. You'll always be fine. We'll make sure of it. We'll make sure of it." I closed my eyes. That sentence, more than any joke or assumption, clarified everything. He wasn't offering help if I needed it. He was promising management, oversight, authority born from familiarity, not consent. I pictured the bank forms in my folder, the quiet rows of numbers, the options I hadn't committed to yet. I appreciate your concern, I said evenly. You don't need to overthink things, he added quickly. Family takes care of each other. There it was, the final seal. Care equated with control. Love blurred into entitlement. We spoke a little longer about work, about nothing important. When we hung up, I remained standing in the dark kitchen, phone still in my hand. I didn't feel angry. I felt clear. This was the moment. Not dramatic. Not explosive. Just precise. That night, I pulled out the future folder again. I reread the notes I'd made at the bank. The suggestions. The questions I'd written in the margins. I wasn't acting out of spite or fear. I was acting out of alignment. Over the next few days, I moved quietly. I scheduled another appointment. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't hint. I didn't seek validation. At the bank, I spoke with certainty this time. I'd like to restructure my accounts, I said. I want clearer boundaries. The executive nodded, professional. Of course. We can look at protected instruments, updated nominations, limited access. Yes, I said. That's what I want. He explained timelines, procedures. Nothing dramatic. Just forms and signatures. Each pen stroke felt oddly grounding. I walked out of the bank lighter than I'd walked in. At home, life continued unchanged. Dinner, conversations, laughter. But something fundamental had shifted, and I could feel it settling into place. I wasn't stepping away from my family. I was stepping toward myself. And for the first time, the future felt like something I was allowed to choose. The changes didn't announce themselves. They arrived quietly, the way real shifts in life usually do. There were no raised voices. No dramatic moments where I felt powerful or vindicated. Just paperwork, appointments, and a steady sense of calm that surprised me with its persistence. At the bank, I took my time. I asked questions I'd never asked before. What happens if I live longer than expected? What protections exist if I become unwell? How much control does access really give someone? The answers weren't emotional. They were practical. And that suited me. I moved my primary savings into protected retirement instruments. Accounts designed for stability, not convenience. I updated beneficiaries carefully, thoughtfully, making sure nothing was automatic or assumed anymore. Access points were reduced. Permissions clarified. Nothing was taken away from anyone. Everything was simply defined. When the bank executive slid the final document across the desk, he smiled politely. This is a good structure, he said. It gives you independence without cutting ties. Independence. The word settled into me like a deep breath. At home, no one noticed anything immediately. Why would they? Money, after all, only becomes visible when it's expected to move. Life went on. My daughter-in-law talked about plans. My son mentioned work pressures. I listened, responded kindly, stayed present. But I didn't volunteer reassurance anymore. Weeks passed. Then one evening, while we were clearing the table, my son frowned at his phone. That's strange, he muttered. I looked up. What is? Nothing, he said quickly. Too quickly. Just something I was checking earlier. He didn't explain and I didn't ask. But the air had shifted just slightly. A thread pulled, not yet unraveling. Over the next few days, I noticed small changes. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Plans were spoken about with less certainty, more qualifiers. We'll see. Maybe later. Depends. One afternoon, my daughter-in-law asked casually, Ma, have you changed anything financially? The question was light, careful, almost accidental. I met her gaze. Why do you ask? She shrugged. Just curious. I nodded. I've been organizing things. That's all. Organizing. Such a harmless word. So accurate. She smiled, but something flickered behind her eyes, calculation perhaps. Or adjustment. That night, my son sat beside me on the sofa. We were just thinking, he said slowly, about future arrangements. You know, planning ahead. I waited. Things feel a bit uncertain lately. he added. I guess we assumed some things. Assumed. I felt a pang then, not guilt but recognition. This was the moment I'd anticipated. Not confrontation but realization. I'm planning ahead too, I said gently. He looked at me surprised, not by the words but by the tone. Calm. Steady. Non-negotiable. Oh, he said. We sat there for a moment, the television murmuring in the background. You're okay though? He asked. You're not worried? I smiled softly. I'm actually feeling very settled. That was the truth. The silence that followed wasn't hostile. It was recalibrating, like a compass being adjusted after years of pointing the wrong way. Later that night, as I lay in bed, I thought about how fragile assumptions are. How easily they collapse when reality shifts even slightly. I hadn't argued. I hadn't explained. I hadn't asked permission. I'd simply chosen. And in doing so, I'd returned something to myself that I hadn't realized I'd lost. The right to decide what my care looked like. Outside, the house settled into its nighttime sounds. Doors closing. Lights switching off. Life continuing. And for the first time in a long while, I felt no need to brace myself for what came next. Because whatever uncertainty they were feeling now, it was the space I'd finally claimed for myself. The house felt different, not tense, just quieter in a way that made room for thought. No one mentioned money anymore. Not directly. Not casually. The certainty that once filled conversations had dissolved into something more cautious, more respectful, or maybe just more aware. I noticed it in small ways. My daughter-in-law stopped speaking about the future as if it were already arranged. My son asked more questions instead of making statements. Plans were framed tentatively now, with pauses where confidence used to live. Nothing had been said aloud. Everything had been understood. One morning I woke earlier than usual. Not because of worry but because the light through the curtains felt inviting. I made tea and sat by the window watching the street wake up. A woman walked her dog. A man watered plants. Ordinary life, unfolding without urgency. I realized how rarely I'd allowed myself moments like this. Unclaimed, unproductive, just mine. Later that week I booked a small trip. Nothing extravagant. Just a quiet place I'd once visited long ago and remembered fondly. I didn't announce it at dinner. I didn't ask if it worked for everyone else's schedule. I simply booked it. When I mentioned it in passing, my son looked surprised. You're going alone? He asked. Yes, I said. There was a pause. Then he nodded. That's nice. Nice. Not dismissive. Not indulgent. Just accepting. That mattered more than he knew. The dynamic between us shifted. Not colder. Not distant, just more balanced. I listened when they needed support. I helped when I chose to. But the unspoken assumption that my life existed as an extension of theirs was gone. And strangely, love felt cleaner without it. One evening, my son sat with me on the balcony. The air was cool, the city quiet below. I didn't realize, he said slowly, that we'd been planning for you. I didn't rush to respond. I should have asked, he added. I nodded. Yes. That was all. No apology demanded. No reassurance offered. Just truth placed gently between us. He sat with that for a while, then said, I'm glad you're thinking about yourself. I believed him. Not because his words were perfect, but because they came without expectation. As the days passed, I felt something settle into place. A sense of authorship over my own time. My routine softened. I stopped measuring days by usefulness and started noticing how they felt. Retirement no longer felt like a threat to stability. It felt like a continuation of something I'd earned. On the morning I left for my trip, I stood at the door with my bag. My daughter-in-law wished me well. My son reminded me to call when I arrived. Their care was genuine. And this time it didn't cost me my future. As the car pulled away, I looked back at the house. Not with resentment, not with triumph. With clarity. I hadn't taken anything from them. I had simply stopped giving what was never theirs to claim. And in that quiet decision, I found something I hadn't realized I was missing all these years. Peace.